玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简·奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。配音 Margaret
Tanner。Chapter 3 Mr. Woodhouse goes out to dinner. Another week passed, and Mr. Elton still had not proposed to Harriet. John Knightley was bringing his family to Highbury for the Christmas holiday, and Emma was very busy getting Hartfield ready for their visit. Mr. Woodhouse was a kind man, and he loved his family very much. But he was easily upset, and he worried about many things. He worried most about his health and the health of his family. He did not like bad weather and any kind of travel. He hated change of every kind. The weather was now very cold, and the ground was hard and slippery with ice. Mr. Woodhouse was very worried about the Knightleys' journey from London to Highbury. 16 miles is a long way, he said, and the roads are bad at this time of year. However, the Knightleys all arrived safely, and Mr. Woodhouse was delighted to see his daughter Isabella and her children again. Isabella, Mrs. John Knightley, was very like her father. She worried about her health and her children's health. Isabella was not as clever as her younger sister Emma, but she was very kind. John Knightley, Emma's brother-in-law, was a clever and very successful lawyer. But he was not as pleasant as his brother George Knightley of Donwell Abbey. John Knightley became angry easily, and he always said what he thought. Isabella was never upset by her husband's behaviour. She took no notice of it. John Knightley liked to tease his friends and relations, and his words sometimes upset them or made them angry. That evening, John's elder brother, Mr. George Knightley, walked to Hartfield from his house, Donwell Abbey. He was dining with the Woodhouses too. Mr. Knightley and Emma had not spoken to each other since their quarrel. Emma was holding her little niece in her arms when Mr. Knightley came into the sitting-room. Emma looked up and saw that he was smiling at them both. "Is not little Emma a beautiful child?" Emma said quietly, looking down at the baby. "She is nearly as beautiful as her aunt," Mr. Knightley replied. "We can agree on that, if not on other things. Let us be friends again, my dearest Emma. Let us forget our quarrel." "I shall be pleased to forget it," Emma said. "I know that I am spoilt. I do not think that I was wrong about Harriet and Robert Martin. But I upset you, and I am sorry. Shake hands with me, Mr. Knightley. We have different ideas, but we can still be friends." They shook hands, and the rest of the evening passed very pleasantly. Only Mr. Woodhouse was unhappy. "My dear Isabella, you look tired," he said to his elder daughter. "You and the children have had a tiring journey. You must all go to bed early tonight. Dr. Perry is coming to see me tomorrow. He will check that I am well. He can check the children too. We must look after their health while they are at Hartfield." "The children are all quite well, Papa," Isabella said with a kind smile. "And I am not tired at all." Soon Isabella began to talk about her good friends, Mrs. and Miss Bates. She was pleased to hear that they were both well. "And what about Miss Bates's niece, Jane Fairfax?" Isabella went on. "Sometimes I see her in London with her guardians, the Campbells. Jane is so clever and so beautiful. Do you not agree, Emma? You could be such good friends if Jane lived in Highbury." Emma has a friend, Miss Harriet Smith. She is a very pretty girl, Mr. Woodhouse said. Harriet often stays with us. You will see her here very soon. Time passed quickly and happily at Hartfield. Emma, Mr. Woodhouse, Mr. Knightley, and Isabella and John Knightley were invited to dine with the Westons at Randalls on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. Mr. Elton and Harriet were also invited to the dinner party that evening. Harriet had been staying at Hartfield, but then she caught a very bad cold. Isabella was afraid that her children would become ill too, so Harriet went back to the school where Mrs. Goddard could look after her. Emma went to see Harriet on the morning of the 24th of December. The poor girl had a sore throat, and her face was very pale. "You cannot come to Randalls tonight. You are too ill," Emma said. "Mr. Elton will be sorry that you are not there." As Emma left the school, she met Mr. Elton himself and told him about Harriet's cold and sore throat. "I am afraid that Harriet will have to stay at home tonight. She has a bad cold," Emma said. "And you have been visiting her, Miss Woodhouse?" Mr. Elton said in surprise. "That is not right. You must think of your own health." "You look rather pale, Mr. Elton," Emma told him. "Perhaps you should stay at home too." Emma expected Mr. Elton to agree. He could stay at home instead of going to dinner at Randalls, she thought. He could think of Harriet. He could write her a loving letter. But at that moment they met John Knightley. He offered to take Mr. Elton in his carriage to Randalls that evening, and with a happy smile, Mr. Elton agreed. As Mr. Elton walked away quickly, Emma's brother-in-law laughed. "That young man always smiles when he sees you, Emma," John Knightley said. "I think that he is in love with you. Please be careful." And he laughed again. He enjoyed teasing his sister-in-law. "No, you are wrong. Mr. Elton loves Miss Smith, not me," Emma said. "Mr. Elton and I are good friends, nothing more." But John Knightley laughed once again and shook his head. By the evening, the weather was extremely cold. Mr. Woodhouse, Emma, Isabella and her husband were going to travel from Hartfield to Randalls in 2 carriages. Mr. Woodhouse went in his own carriage with Isabella. Emma went with John Knightley in his carriage, and they drove to the vicarage to collect Mr. Elton. The vicar was waiting for them with a happy smile. He smiled at Emma all the way to Randalls, and did not stop praising her. John Knightley listened, but he said nothing. Emma was worried. Did Mr. Elton think that she loved him? No, it was impossible. At dinner, Emma sat next to Mr. Weston. He was talking about his son, Frank Churchill. "Yes, we had a letter from Frank this morning," Mr. Weston said, smiling happily. "My son is planning to visit us here in Highbury. He will be here in 2 weeks. His aunt, Mrs. Churchill, is often ill, and she does not like Frank to leave her. But he will come this time, I know." Emma was delighted to hear this news. She had always wanted to meet Mr. Frank Churchill, and she knew that Mrs. Weston did too. After dinner, Emma spoke to Mrs. Weston about Frank's visit. "I am looking forward to seeing Mr. Frank Churchill at Highbury," she said. "I hope that Mrs. Churchill will let him come," Mrs. Weston replied. "She is a bad-tempered woman, and she is very jealous of Mr. Weston. She wants to keep Frank with her at Enscombe, if she can." "If Frank Churchill wants to come here, I am sure that he will," Emma said. The gentlemen came into the room where the ladies were sitting, and everyone had tea. Mr. Elton sat next to Emma. He was smiling more and more. He began talking about Harriet's sore throat. But Emma soon understood that he was worried about her, not Harriet. "Miss Woodhouse must think about her own health, Mrs. Weston," the young vicar said. "Miss Woodhouse is important to us all. Please tell her to be careful, Mrs. Weston. She will listen to you." Mrs. Weston was surprised at Mr. Elton's words, but she said nothing. At that moment, John Knightley left the room for a few minutes. When he came back, he was smiling. "Well, sir," he said to Mr. Woodhouse, "we shall all have an exciting journey home. Snow has been falling for some time." Mr. Woodhouse hated excitement, and he especially hated bad weather. He looked worried, and Isabella did too. "My poor children," she cried. "I must get back to them tonight. Will the carriages be able to travel through the snow on the road?" Everyone stood up and began talking at once. Mr. Knightley looked at his brother John and frowned. Then he left the room. He came back a few minutes later. "There is very little snow," Mr. Knightley said quietly to Emma. "John was teasing us. If you all leave now, you will have a safe journey home. Shall I tell the servants to bring the carriages to the door?" "Yes, please do." "Thank you," Emma said quickly. Soon everyone was ready to go. Mr. Woodhouse slowly got into his own carriage, and Isabella followed him. John Knightley got in too, and the carriage moved on. Emma got into the second carriage, and she was followed by Mr. Elton, who sat beside her. They were alone. Then Emma saw that Mr. Elton had been drinking too much of Mr. Weston's good wine. As the carriage began to move, Mr. Elton took Emma's hand and held it in his own. "My dear Miss Woodhouse," he cried, "I cannot hide my feelings any longer. They are too strong. You must know how much I love you. Please accept my proposal of marriage and make me the happiest of men." Emma was angry, but she did not show her true feelings. "Mr. Elton, you should be saying these things to Harriet, not to me," she said quietly. "Miss Smith? I do not care for Miss Harriet Smith," Mr. Elton cried. "I love you, Miss Woodhouse, only you." Emma was silent. She did not know what to say. "You are making me very happy, Miss Woodhouse," Mr. Elton said, smiling. "Your silence tells me that your feelings are the same as mine." "Mr. Elton, you are very wrong," Emma said angrily. "I have no wish to marry anyone, and I would certainly never marry you." They sat silently until they reached the vicarage. Mr. Elton got out of the carriage without saying another word, and Emma was taken home to Hartfield. She did not sleep well that night. She had been very wrong about Mr. Elton. He had never loved Harriet Smith. "That silly young man thinks that he is my equal," Emma thought. "I cannot believe it. Mr. Knightley and his brother John were right about Mr. Elton, and I was wrong." Then Emma thought again about Harriet. Her friend would soon have to be told the truth. Mr. Elton had never loved the poor girl. But Emma was still sure of one thing. She was glad that Harriet had refused to marry Mr. Martin. The pretty girl could make a better match than the young farmer.